Today on Shop Nation, I do a quick tool review of my Delta 36-725 table saw and tell you exactly what I like and what I don't like about it. If you are interested in buying this saw, this video is for you. Now I've had this saw for about 2 years and I've really put it through its paces. I used it to build the entire wall of cabinets that we did, the ultimate shop workbench, my upstairs desk, and a lot of other projects throughout the shop. I know that when I'm looking for a tool review, I don't want to watch somebody unbox it and then give me their opinion on it. So now that I've had it set up in my shop, working, and put it through pretty much any scenario that you would probably encounter, I can now tell you what I like and what I don't like. So before we get started on the review of this particular saw, if you're in the market for a table saw, there's really three kind of categories that you would probably be looking at. The first is what I'll call the light duty or contractor saw. So these saws, by nature of their use, like throwing it in the back of a truck to a job site, are smaller. So this means you get less rip capacity, a smaller table, and typically the legs are either foldable or they're completely separate from the saw. Now these represent the cheapest of the three categories, ranging anywhere from $100 on the low end to about $400 for a pretty decent one. Now don't think because you're maybe looking at that category of saw that the quality of work is going to be somehow less than going with a larger saw. You can find guys throughout the internet who are doing amazing work with these small contractor portable saws. The second category of saw is where this saw lives, and it's sort of in the in-between range. It's still considered a contractor saw, but it is not designed to be taken from job site to job site. So these saws typically have a mobile base, a larger table, longer rip capacity, and typically a much better fence system. The price range for this category of saw is anywhere from about $500 to $1,000. This kind of saw makes a lot of sense for the small workshops such as mine, where occasionally you may need to move the saw in and out of the way. Finally, the third category of table saw is a true cabinet style table saw. Now these things are beasts, but you pay for it. These saws typically have massive tables, really wide rip capacities, and top-notch fence options. Many of those saws are also higher voltage, 230 volt single phase, and you're able to get a lot more power out of your saw and cut a lot easier. Now the price range for those saws really range anywhere from about $1,200 to $4,000 and above. If you have the means to go with one of those saws right off the bat, more power to you. So with that being said, when I was looking for a table saw, I knew I was looking in that middle category. I actually started out looking at the lower end category. I really wasn't happy with the fence setup and the limited rip capacity, which drove me to this larger saw. So the saw that I ultimately purchased and what I'm going to be doing the review on today is a Delta 36-725 table saw. It is a 10-inch, 13-amp table saw that runs off a standard 120 volt outlet. Overall, I am extremely happy with the saw, but there are some things that I want to point out that I think Delta did very well and things that have room for improvement. All right, let's start out with what I like about the saw. Number one, and the thing that attracted to me the saw in the first place, is the fence. In my opinion, this is the best fence that you can get on one of these saws in this price range, plus or minus $300. A fence is probably one of the most important things to look at on a saw. Now there are options to retrofit a better fence on a lot of saws, but you do not have that option a lot of times if you're going with a small contractor saw. So if you are in that category, definitely look at the fence. Number two, rip capacity. This particular saw has a rip capacity on the right side of 30 inches, which means you can cut over a half a sheet of plywood. On the left-hand side, the rip capacity is 15 inches, which again is pretty good. The higher the rip capacity, the more versatile the saw is, in my opinion, and oftentimes prevents you from making unsafe cuts. Number three is the cast iron top. Now this is something that you'll find on a lot of saws. Once you get past $500 or $600, cast iron kind of becomes a standard option. But cast iron really gives you a solid foundation on which to cut. Now the wings of this saw are sheet metal. I really do wish they were cast iron, but they are what they are. I actually just did a recent video on preservation of shop tools. I cleaned up and preserved the cast iron top on my table saw. And as an update, the glide coat that I used as the protectant is working really, really well. There is still one area where I don't think I quite cleaned the rust well enough and it kind of came back, but by and large, the rest of the table is rust-free. The fourth thing I like is the arbor size. Now the arbor is essentially the drive shaft on which the blade sits. Now this saw, as well as a lot of other full-size saws, have a 5/8 inch arbor, which means that you can use a dado stack to cut dados on your table saw. One downside of going with a small contractor saw is many of those arbors are not sized to use a dado safely. Okay, so now on to the dislikes. Now this list is shorter and the issues are arguably smaller, so it still heavily favors the likes. The first dislike is the inefficient dust collection. So the Ultimate Workbench that I built has an automated dust collection system that's tied into the table saw. So anytime the table saw is kicked on, the dust collection kicks on as well. If I'm cutting a lot of wood throughout the day, there is a mountain of sawdust that builds up underneath this saw, even with dust collection on and operating. So just know that if you want a truly clean shop, you'll likely have to do some modification on the dust collection system for this saw. The second dislike, which I touched on previously, is the sheet metal wings that are on either side of the cast iron table. Again, ideally, these would be cast iron as well, but I think Delta made a conscious decision to go with sheet metal to lower the weight, knowing that this was going to be a semi-portable table saw. Also, the wing does not extend all the way to the right side, so if you're ripping a thin sheet of material at the full 30-inch capacity, the material can get underneath the fence. Now, that gap on that side also opens up the opportunity for building in a router table into the saw, which a lot of people do, and it's likely something I'm going to pursue in the future. The third thing is the riving knife. Now, a riving knife is a safety feature and highly recommended anytime you're using a table saw. It prevents kickback, which can really suck if it's ever happened to you. The issue with the riving knife is that mine is sort of out of alignment. I don't know if I bent it or it's something to do with the saw, but I'm going to have to find a solution for that. The fourth thing, which really isn't that big of a deal, is as you're changing the miter angle of the blade, the gauge on the saw is really not that accurate. This is a really easy fix, and I just use a simple digital angle gauge for setting the miter on my blade. Now, even if the angle gauge was accurate on the saw, I would still probably use that digital angle gauge, so it's really not that big of a deal. If you are setting up a table saw or any piece of shop equipment in general, I highly recommend this little Wixie digital angle gauge. I'll link that in the description if you're interested. So overall, I think the saw is fantastic. It's done everything I've ever thrown at it, and it's extremely quiet. There are two sort of immediate upgrades that I made once getting the saw, first of which was the blade. Typically, the blade that comes with any saw is not great. So I upgraded to an Irwin 50-tooth finishing blade. Now, this blade works really well for me. I know that a lot of the more serious guys use the red blades, the Diablo brand. Now, I don't have any personal experience with those, but I hear they're really great blades as well. The second upgrade is investing in some safety gear. So the saw comes with a standard push stick, which is fine, but I do plan on making a little bit better one. But the investment really comes in things like this. Any tool that keeps your hand far away from the blade is ideal. So if you are going to get into a table saw, look into the many accessories available. I will link some that I think are great in the description below. So to wrap things up, if you are in the market for a mid-range, well-priced, very capable table saw, I highly recommend this Delta 36-725. As I mentioned, I've had this thing for about 2 years, put it through its paces, and never really had any issues with it. I have seen some reviews where people complained about the instructions during construction. I don't remember having any problems putting it together. I obviously didn't film that part, but from what I can remember, it went together pretty easy. If this is your first time at the channel, please hit subscribe. If you liked the video, hammer that like button, and I will see you at the next project.